The Orion dust belt was silent, except for the low hum of drifting ships and the distant pulse of dying stars as a lone hunter vessel slid through the darkness, its metal hull marked with faded scars from battles fought in systems that no longer existed. Varric, the alien bounty hunter, stood at the viewing deck, his four black eyes locked on a human prisoner transport moving slow and heavy through the dust clouds. He had been tracking it for 2 standard days, and now it was finally within reach. The whispers in the underworld had said this prisoner was different, worth a reward so high it could buy him an entire moon. But they had also come with warnings. Warnings Varric had ignored until now, because as the transport drifted closer, and its scanning lights washed over his ship, he saw the prisoner through the reinforced glass of the cell, and something inside him froze. The human sat perfectly still in the middle of the cell, his hands bound in thick magnetic cuffs, his head lowered, but his eyes visible under the shadow of his brow. They glowed faintly, not with light, but with a strange reflection, and burned into the iris was a black insignia that even Varric had heard of, a mark shaped like a skull with a single crack. Through it, the sign of the Earth's shadow unit. No alien hunter dared touch one of them. No one survived those who tried. There were stories traded in the deep space taverns of bounty hunters, vanishing without a trace after capturing humans with. That Mark I bartender had once leaned in close and told Varric in a voice that trembled, "It's not the soldier you fear. It's what follows him." But Varric had never believed in ghost stories, and now with the prize so close, he told himself fear was for weaker hunters. The reward would be worth it. He locked onto the transport with an ion snare. The ship shuddered and slowed, its thrusters struggling before going dark like a fish caught in a net. Varric's crew moved quickly, boarding tubes. Extended locks clamped, and the hiss of decompression echoed in the narrow halls as they entered the prisoner's ship. The corridors were dim and smelled of burning metal from the ion blast. The human guards on board were unconscious from the stun, pulse leaving the path to the cell clear. When Varric stepped inside, the prisoner did not look up at first. Only when Varric approached and knelt to examine the cuffs did the human lift his head slowly, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through layers of skin and thought. "You're already dead," the prisoner said softly, almost kindly, as if stating a fact, and in that moment the ship's lights flickered, then went out completely. The only sound was the distant groan of metal under stress, and the faint breathing of the crew. Varric, second in command, cursed, fumbling for his visor light, but when it flared on the corridor behind them, was empty. One of their crew was gone, just gone. Not a sound, not a struggle, only the faint smell of ozone in the air. Varric ordered the rest to stay close, but as they moved, the darkness seemed to press tighter around them, swallowing their voices. Footsteps that should have echoed did not, and in the silence, Varric thought he heard another set of steps. Light, precise, and not belonging to any of his crew, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. But when he turned, there was nothing yet. The prisoner smiled faintly, as if listening to something Varric could not hear. Another crewman vanished, pulled away so fast the air rushed in to fill the space where he had stood. Varric's mind screamed to cut his losses and leave, but his pride chained him in place. No one took prey from Varric and lived, reaching again for the cuffs. He felt a pulse of static, and then without any key, without any tool, the locks clicked open, the cuffs fell to the floor with a heavy metallic thud. In the darkness, the prisoner stood tall, stretching his arms and neck with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had been waiting a very long time. Then something impossible happened. Armor began to form around him, not from any machine in the room, but out of the air itself, thin black plates sliding into place across his body, the edges glowing faintly, with a blue shimmer as if reality itself was being bent to make it. Varric took a step back, his instincts finally screaming that this was no bounty. This was a death sentence. The prisoner's visor sealed over his face, the skull insignia now blazing, bright against the black armor, and though Varric could not see his eyes anymore, he felt their weight on him. The human took one step forward, and the metal of the cell door seemed to dissolve away. Clearing his path, Varric had heard the name whispered. In fear, across the galaxy, Shadow Unit soldiers, the ghosts of war that came when every other weapon failed soldiers who never left survivors. Now one stood in front of him, free and armed, and in the silence between them, the only sound was the slow, mechanical hiss of the suit coming fully online. Darkness clung to the corridors like a living thing, swallowing every scrap of light as Varric backed away from the armored human, his claws curling around the grip of his plasma rifle even though some instinct deep inside told him it would be useless. The hum of the prisoner's suit was low, almost like a slow heartbeat. Steady and deliberate, a sound that made the air feel heavier. Varric's crew of 5 was now 3, the other 2 taken, by something unseen and silent, their absence leaving only a weight of fear hanging in the stale air. The prisoner didn't move, at first simply tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something far away. Varric's second-in-command, a scarred reptilian named Krath, growled and raised his weapon, a sharp hiss of plasma building in its chamber before he could fire. The weapon flickered once and died, the lights on its barrel dimming to nothing. Krath cursed and slammed it against the wall, but the human simply turned his gaze toward him, and in that instant, Krath was gone. Not blasted away, not cut down, simply gone. As though the space he occupied had been wiped from existence. The air where he had stood crackled faintly with static. Varric's throat tightened, his black eyes darting to the prisoner whose armor absorbed the darkness around them, making it hard to tell where he ended and the shadows began. Varric had heard legends about this, about bounty hunters who brought in the wrong human and vanished before they could even collect their reward in alien bars across the galaxy. The old ones would speak of it low and serious. The Shadow Unit, they called them ghosts. Soldiers created by Earth's military for wars, that were never spoken of soldiers who were said to be more weapon than flesh, and trained to make their enemies disappear without a trace. Some called them assassins, others called them hunters of hunters, all agreed on one thing: you did not survive. If they chose you, the prisoner finally spoke, his voice deep and calm. The way a predator's is before the strike, leave now, bounty hunter, or you will meet the rest of us. His words dripped with certainty as if the outcome was already decided. Varric tried to steady his voice. You're bluffing. There's no one else here, but his words felt small. Swallowed by the thick silence, the prisoner stepped forward, the cell door melting away into the floor like ice under heat. His footsteps made no sound, yet each one sent a shiver through Varric's chest. From somewhere deep in the ship came a faint metallic thud, followed by another, then another. In perfect rhythm, Varric's ship scanners pinged automatically on his wrist display, and the data made his hearts lurch. Multiple contacts just outside the hull. Human dropships exiting hyperspace in perfect formation, each one marked with the same black skull insignia. Every single one of them stealthed their life signs hidden from scans. Varric's escape routes flashed red on the display, blocked in all directions. The prisoner's visor turned slightly as if he already knew the ships had arrived. Then, without looking at Varric, he said, "They're here." Varric's crew panicked, one of them bolting toward the boarding tube, the sound of his boots pounding the deck echoing in the narrow hall. It lasted only a few seconds before the sound cut off mid-stride and silence returned. Varric could feel it now, something else moving in the ship. The same precise steps he had heard before, but now there were many of them, each one deliberate and soft like predators circling prey. The corridor lights flickered once, twice, and then the air temperature dropped, the kind of cold that clung to the inside of your lungs. Varric turned sharply, his rifle still dead in his hands, and for the first time he saw them, or at least he thought he did, shapes darker than the shadows themselves moving through the air, their armor identical to the prisoners. But without the faint blue glow, their visors were blank empty, yet fixed on him. One appeared only a few steps away. Though he hadn't heard it arrive, the faint outline of a blade shimmered in its hand and then was gone. Varric stepped back and his heel caught the edge of the cell threshold. The prisoner was still there watching him unmoving, but now flanked by two more armored humans. They were like statues, but Varric could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him. It was the weight of inevitability. He had boarded this ship, thinking he was the predator now. He was something else entirely, prey. And in that moment, he understood the old bartender's words. It's not the soldier you fear. It's what follows him. The metallic thuds outside the ship grew louder as more dropships attached themselves to the hull. Varric's mind raced. He could try to fight, he could try to run, but deep down, he already knew it wouldn't matter. The prisoner stepped past him, heading toward the ship's control deck without a word. The others followed their movements in perfect unison, silent and fluid as water. And though they made no sound, Varric could swear he felt the ship itself react as if bending to their presence. And then just before the corridor, the darkness felt heavier now, almost alive, wrapping around Varric like invisible chains. Each breath he took came slow, as if the air itself resisted him. And then a faint glow shimmered ahead, the prisoner's visor, the skull insignia, bright enough to slice through the black. Varric followed without thinking, his feet moving on their own, pulled forward by some mix of fear and the strange calm radiating from the human. The corridor opened into the control deck, its walls lined with cracked screens, and the faint hum of emergency systems trying to restart the prisoner stepped into the center, his armor catching the dim light like a predator standing in the mouth of a cave. He turned toward Varric and spoke, his voice low, "And even you have 5 minutes to leave. After that, I can't protect you from them." Varric's ears twitched, the words sinking into his skull. "Not protect me from you?" he asked. But the prisoner didn't answer. Instead, his visor tilted slightly as if listening to a voice. Only he could hear outside the ship. The dark shapes of the human dropships hovered against the black of space, their hulls absorbing every trace of light. Varric's wrist display flickered, as if struggling to process their presence every time. He tried to scan them. The data came back blank. No readings, no signals, only static. His claws tapped nervously against the console as his mind scrambled for a way out. The boarding tubes were still locked. The ion snare he had used to capture the transport had burned out from some unseen surge. Even his ship's core systems were beginning to fail, one by one, as if something was crawling through them from the outside. Varric stepped closer to the prisoner. "If they want me, they'll have to. Take me alive, I don't die easy." The human's visor turned toward him, and Varric felt an unseen pressure behind those words, as if the soldier was weighing his worth like a judge at a trial. "Your death would not be the point," the human said finally. And before Varric could ask what he meant, a sharp vibration rattled the deck. The ship's sensors blared, then went silent again. Multiple life forms detected, one moment gone the next. The prisoner straightened. "The rest of my unit is here now." The voice inside his helmet carried no pride, no arrogance, just an absolute certainty that made Varric's chest tighten. The dropships outside began to shift, moving in a formation so precise it looked choreographed, every one of them locking into position, along the hull with the soundless grace of predators circling prey. The control deck's side window caught a flicker of movement, something human-shaped, sliding across the outer hull without any tether or thruster, as if walking on the skin of the ship. Varric's clawed fingers dug into the console. "They're not using suits for vacuum," he muttered half to himself. The prisoner didn't look at him. "They don't need them." Varric's second-in-command would have called it impossible, but Krath was gone like the rest. The reality was undeniable. The shadow unit was inside the ship, moving closer every second. The silence between their steps was worse than the sound itself, too measured, too exact, as if the space between each movement was calculated. The control deck door hissed faintly and opened without a sound. 3 figures stepped inside, all wearing armor identical to the prisoner. Their visors blank, their movements eerily synchronized. The one in the center carried no weapon. Yet every line of his stance radiated control. He stopped a few feet from Varric, tilting his head slightly like a predator assessing prey. "You've touched one of ours." The voice was cold, even mechanical. "You know what happens next?" Varric's throat felt dry. He had no answer. The one in the center stepped forward, but the prisoner raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet. He's useful." A silence hung heavy between them before the leader inclined his head once a signal. Varric didn't understand. Then, without warning, the other two soldiers seemed to blur and vanish into the shadows, leaving no trace. The prisoner stepped closer to Varric, his voice low. "They're giving you a chance, but only because I told them to listen. You're not here by accident." "Bounty hunter you were sent?" Varric's eyes narrowed. "Sent I take contracts, I go where the credits are." The human shook his head. "Not this time. They wanted you to find me. Someone did, and when you did, they knew you would lead them to what they're—" Looking for Varric's mind raced. But before he could demand answers, the control deck shuddered hard enough to knock him into the console. Warning lights flared, then died again. The prisoner turned sharply, his visor reflecting a faint red glow. Bleeding in from the edge of the viewing glass through the swirling dust outside, something massive was moving, blotting out the stars. A ship bigger than any Varric had seen before, its hull jagged like bone, its engines pulsing with deep crimson. Light Varric felt his stomach twist in recognition. He knew that ship. He knew the crest burned into its side. It belonged to someone he had once sworn loyalty to long before he ever heard of the Shadow Unit, and now it was here coming for the prisoner. Massive warship slid out of the dust clouds like a predator emerging from deep water, its jagged hull lit by the slow pulse of crimson engines. The sheer size of it made the human dropships look like drifting debris compared to the monstrous vessel. Closing in, Varric's throat tightened as his eyes locked on the crest burned into its side, a black talon wrapped around a burning star. It was the mark of the Crimson Syndicate, and more than that, it was the personal flagship of Careth Varric's former commander, the one he had sworn loyalty to, cycles ago before betrayal turned them into enemies. The presence of that ship here was no coincidence. Varric realized with a sick weight in his chest. They were here for the prisoner, but also for him. The control deck lights flickered and dimmed as the Shadow Unit soldiers remained perfectly still, their armor absorbing the glow from the viewing glass, their leader's visor tilted slightly as though listening to something distant. "They're early," the leader said, his voice flat but edged with something colder. Varric turned sharply early for what he demanded, but no one answered. Instead, the three Shadow Unit soldiers moved in perfect unison toward the viewing deck, standing shoulder to shoulder like silent statues. Outside, the Crimson warship launched smaller vessels, each one shaped like a blade cutting through the void. They moved faster than anything Varric's scanners could track. One moment the ships were specks against the dust. The next they were attaching to the hull with a sharp metallic thud. Varric flinched at the sound, knowing it meant boarding claws were already cutting into the transport's skin. The Shadow Unit didn't flinch, didn't move as the ship shook under the assault. The prisoner stepped forward, the hiss of his armor's servos breaking the silence. He glanced once at Varric. "Stay behind me, bounty hunter. You won't survive what's coming." Varric almost laughed bitterly, thinking there was no place left on this ship that could be called safe. But the look in the prisoner's visor froze him. The kind of cold certainty that only came from someone who had walked through battlefields and never once doubted the outcome. Then, the first Syndicate soldiers breached the corridor, the hiss of cutting torches giving way to a burst of pressurized air and the heavy clang of armored boots hitting the deck. They were tall, broad aliens with red-tinged armor, each carrying shock rifles that glowed faintly in the low light. They moved with speed and precision, but the moment they stepped into the control deck corridor, everything changed. The first syndicate soldier raised his rifle only for the lights to cut out completely the corridor, plunged into blackness, and in that blackness the sound came soft, deliberate footsteps moving toward them. The syndicate soldiers shouted in their native tongue, trying to form a defensive line, but the sound of their voices cut short, replaced by the hiss of armor seals breaking and the dull thud of bodies hitting the deck. Varric couldn't see them, but he could feel it. The shadow unit had vanished from the deck and was now in the corridor hunting without a sound. The prisoner didn't. Move still standing in the center of the control deck, like an anchor in the storm. The air temperature dropped again. Each breath Varric took forming a faint cloud. The screams from the corridor were brief and cut with surgical precision, one by one until only silence remained, then shapes darker than the dark itself slid back into the room. The three Shadow Unit soldiers, their armor unmarked, as if nothing had happened. Varric's chest tightened. This was why no alien hunter dared challenge. Them, they weren't fighters. They were inevitability. The leader turned his visor toward the prisoner. The others are moving to flank the warship's boarding teams. The prisoner gave a short nod, and then for the first time his voice carried something. Heavier, prepare the deck. We finish this before Kareth arrives. The name hit Varric like a blade. Kareth is here. The prisoner didn't look at him, but his silence was enough of an answer. The deck shuddered again as more syndicate ships latched onto. The hull, Varric's wrist display, blinked with dozens of hostile signatures, flooding into the ship's outer corridors. The prisoner raised his gauntleted hand and from his wrist projected a faint blue holographic map of the transport, every red dot representing a syndicate soldier, and every green mark showing shadow unit positions. Varric stared in disbelief. The humans were everywhere, already inside the ship, cutting through the attackers before they even reached the inner decks. The map shifted as the red dots began to vanish one after another in rapid bursts. The prisoner closed the map, his armor humming with a deep, resonant pulse. The crimson warship filled the entire viewing glass, now its hull so close that the glowing veins of its power conduits were visible like molten rivers under black armor. Varric could almost feel the low vibration of its engines through the deck, a steady pulse that reminded him of a predator's breathing. He knew Kareth well enough to understand this was not a simple retrieval. This was a statement the kind the Crimson Syndicate made before wiping out everything in their path. The Shadow Unit soldiers stood unmoving as if the ship's presence meant nothing to them. Their leader's visor remained fixed on the massive vessel, while the prisoner slowly turned to face Varric. "You want to know why you're still alive, bounty hunter?" The human's voice was low, but it cut through the hum of the deck. Varric said nothing. The human continued, "Because you're part of this now. You didn't catch me by chance. You were meant to find me. Someone sent you here to trigger this." Varric felt his jaw tighten. "That's not how I work. I take contracts from the board. I pick the jobs myself. The prisoner's tone didn't change you. Pick the one they wanted you to pick." Varric's mind raced through possibilities the Syndicate had. No reason to use him like this unless they thought they could break the Shadow Unit's secrecy, but even that didn't explain the precision with which events had unfolded. The human stepped closer, the armor whispering with each movement we needed. "Bait to draw them out. We used you." Varric's hands curled into fists. "So I was the prey in your trap." The prisoner tilted his head slightly. Not prey a signal, and it worked. Varric wanted to argue, but his words froze when the deck shook violently. A deep, booming thud echoing through the hull. The control screens flared briefly, showing multiple breach points across the ship corridors filled with Syndicate forces. The Shadow Unit leader turned his head sharply. Initiate protocol, echo the words. Carried a weight Varric didn't understand. But the effect on the humans was immediate. The three soldiers in the deck moved at once, blurring into the shadows and vanishing, as if they had stepped sideways out of existence. The prisoner remained, but now there was an unmistakable tension in his stance, a readiness that spoke of violence waiting to be unleashed. The breach alarms wailed faintly before being silenced, as if cut at the source. The only sound now was the faint hiss of recycled air and the low growl of the crimson warship outside Varric's claws tapped against the console as he glanced at the prisoner. "You're going to fight them all, aren't you?" The human's visor turned toward him and the faint blue glow behind. The glass brightened. "We're going to finish what they started years ago." Varric frowned. "You're talking like, Kareth." The prisoner's voice dropped lower. "I don't just know him. I've been hunting him." The admission hit Varric harder than he expected. Kareth had built a reputation across half the galaxy as a warlord whose strategies were so precise they bordered on prophetic. He had never been cornered, never been beaten yet. The human spoke of hunting him as if it were inevitable. The deck doors hissed open and one of the Shadow Unit soldiers reappeared, his armor slick with faint scorch marks. "Two corridors secure, leader. The rest of the teams are pushing the hostiles back toward Breach Point 6. The leader gave a short nod, then looked to the prisoner. "Extraction is ready if you have the target." The prisoner shook his head. "Not yet, we're taking the ship." The Shadow Unit soldier didn't question him, simply vanished again without a sound. Varric's stomach knotted. The idea of taking a ship this size from the Syndicate was suicide. But as he glanced at the human and remembered what had happened to his crew, he realized suicide didn't apply to these soldiers. The prisoner began walking toward the deck doors, without looking back. "Stay close. Bounty hunter, if you want to live." Varric followed reluctantly, his mind torn between the urge to escape and the pull of wanting to see what these humans were truly capable of. The corridors beyond the control deck were littered with the bodies of Syndicate soldiers, their armor cracked, their weapons still in their hands. Not a single human body among them. Every kill was clean, precise, the kind of work only done by people who had turned it into an art. They passed through one section where the lights flickered, and Varric caught sight of two Shadow Unit soldiers moving along the ceiling, their armor blending perfectly with the shadows, until they dropped silently onto an unsuspecting Syndicate patrol. Wiping them out before they could even raise their weapons, Varric had fought in dozens of campaigns, but he had never seen killing done like this. It wasn't rage or chaos. It was a cold, unstoppable rhythm. The prisoner stopped, suddenly raising. "A hand there here." Varric opened his mouth to ask who, when the deck ahead of them shook and the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. The air filled with the deep metallic groan of something massive forcing its way inside. A moment later, a figure stepped into view, towering in crimson armor, his helmet shaped like the talon in the Syndicate crest. Kareth. His voice rumbled through the corridor. "Bounty hunter, you've been busy." Varric felt the weight of the past crash into him, but before he could speak, the prisoner stepped forward between them, his visor gleaming with the reflection of Kareth's crimson armor. "You came for me, now I'm here." The corridor fell silent as the two faced each other, and Varric realized with a chill that the real battle was only just beginning. The corridor seemed to shrink under the weight of the two figures facing each other. The air thick with a tension so sharp, Varric felt it press against his chest. Kareth stood in his crimson armor, motionless, yet radiating the kind of presence that made lesser beings step back without realizing it. His talon-shaped helm tilted slightly, as if measuring the human before him, and then his voice rumbled low and deep. "I've crossed half the galaxy for you, soldier." The prisoner's visor glowed faintly as he took a single step forward, his voice even and cold. "Then you've crossed it for nothing." For a moment neither moved, the silence stretching so long that Varric felt the thud of his own hearts. In his ears then, without warning, the air between them rippled like heat-bending light, and the world exploded into motion. Kareth's massive blade ignited in a streak of molten red, while the prisoner's gauntlet projected a short, curved shield of shimmering blue energy. The first strike came so fast, Varric barely saw it. The sound of metal on energy ringing through the corridor like a single note. The impact threw sparks across the walls. Kareth pressed forward, his strikes heavy each one. Aimed to break, not just the shield, but the man behind it. The prisoner didn't yield every step he took. Backward was calculated, his movements economical precise, like water bending but never breaking around stone. Then the shadows moved the rest. Of the shadow unit appearing without sound, their black armor rippling, as if reality itself hesitated around them. They didn't rush, they simply flowed forward, surrounding the syndicate soldiers, flooding into the corridor. The fight became chaos. In an instant, Varric pressed himself against the wall as the air filled with the hiss of energy blades, the crack of magnetic rifles, and the silent killing strikes of the human ghosts. The shadow unit fought without words, their coordination perfect. As if they shared a single mind, syndicate soldiers fell in seconds, each one dropped with surgical precision. Kareth didn't glance at his troops. His focus was locked entirely on the prisoner. Varric realized with a jolt that this was more than a mission. This was personal. The prisoner shifted suddenly, letting Kareth's next strike glance off the shield and using the momentum to drive a crushing blow into Kareth's chest. The crimson armor staggered for the first time, but the warlord only laughed a deep sound that made the deck seem smaller. You're strong, human, but strength alone won't stop me. The prisoner's voice carried no emotion. I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to end you before Varric could process the meaning. The human's free hand flicked forward, releasing a small disc that hit Kareth's armor and dissolved instantly, sending thin lines of glowing blue racing across the crimson plates. Kareth swung again, but his movements slowed the blue light spreading. Like frost over his body, the warlord roared, the sound shaking the corridor, but the prisoner didn't stop pressing the attack. Each strike of his gauntlet cracking through the crimson plates until a final blow sent Kareth crashing to one knee. The remaining syndicate soldiers hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. The shadow unit closed in, erasing them with silent, brutal efficiency. The corridor grew still, except for Kareth's ragged breathing. He looked up at the prisoner through the narrow slit of his helm. This isn't over, human. The prisoner crouched down, his visor inches from Kareth's helm. It is for you. And with a single precise motion he drove his blade through the joint in Kareth's armor. The warlord went still, the blue frost-like glow flaring once before fading completely. The shadow unit moved instantly, clearing the corridor of bodies, dragging the fallen away, until only Varric, the prisoner, and the leader remained. Varric's claws tightened around his rifle, though he knew it would do nothing. The prisoner turned toward him, his voice calm again. You've seen what we are now. You understand why no bounty hunter comes for us. Varric swallowed his pride enough to nod. I understand, but that doesn't mean I'll forget. The human's visor tilted slightly. You won't have to. The leader of the shadow unit stepped forward, planting a small black device on Varric's chest plate. It clicked once, and a faint pulse ran through it. A tracker. Varric realized, his eyes narrowing, why the leader's voice was low. Because you run fast, bounty hunter.